I'm Phil Bereano. I'm one of the co-founders of ACT UP Seattle. I'm an activist in the American Civil Liberties Union, and the ACLU is very much involved in AIDS activities in Washington State. ACT UP Seattle grew out of a meeting that was held at the Lutheran Church on 11th Avenue, in which Ellen Ferguson and Thatcher Bailey brought two people to Seattle who were AIDS activists to talk. One was from San Francisco and one was from New York. Early meetings were very interesting. First of all, from the very beginning, ACT UP Seattle had a large proportion of women. But some ACT UP organizations, even in large cities, were almost all male. So one of the neat things about Seattle ACT UP was the gender balance. Second was the fact that it involved not only gay men who had gotten HIV or lovers of such people, but drug users. A number of our key activists were people who were or had been drug users. ACT UP Seattle was almost completely white. The most notable African American was Brian Day. There were very few other people of color. Some of these people were just incredible people, and many of them had come out of areas of organizing and work that I was only vaguely aware of. A number of the women, for example, doing things in the women's movement. Even though I've been involved in the women's movement, I didn't know about the things that they had worked on. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization. The other thing was that we had the Black Freedom Movement, of course, and all of the many examples it had given us, and just the way ACT UP in turn developed techniques and strategies that subsequent groups like Occupy, like Black Lives Matter, etc., have used and adapted, and some of them were much more profound, like the die-ins. There are die-ins occurring now in 2020 as part of the Black Lives Matters movement. ACT UP Seattle did three totally incredible things. One, we took a lesson from a guy in Tacoma who was giving out, exchanging needles to drug users, clean needles, to stop the spread of the disease. People brought it up the pike and said, we need to do this in a big city where it'll get more attention. But ACT UP went around to pharmacies, and I don't know how they convinced these people to get clean needles. Needles are defined in Washington state law as contraband. So this was a pretty cheeky thing to do, and to get the pharmacists to comply. And then at the same time we were doing this, we knew people in the health department, people like our friend Bob Wood and others, who were very much in favor of a public needle exchange because they understood that this kind of risk reduction was so important. But the head of the health department was not on board. So my understanding of the dynamic was we would set up the needle exchange, and then people like Bob and others could go to the head of the health department and say, you don't want those crazies handling contraband and dealing with all this stuff. We should take this over. So we had it planned the first morning. It was at the columns, which are on Boren at the beginning of Capitol Hill. And I used a contact with a reporter that I had at the PI, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and said, I'm going to give you a big scoop if you can promise me you'll try and get it on the front page. He said, well, of course, Phil, I'm sure it's an important story, but I can't guarantee anything. So I gave him the scoop about this whole thing. And so at 5 o'clock that morning, the PI started to be delivered, and there on the front page was an article that at 8 a.m., ACT UP Seattle was going to set up a needle exchange. The result of our doing that really energized the movement in other cities to fight for needle exchanges. ACT UP Seattle eventually produced a book on how to set up a needle exchange. The other major thing ACT UP Seattle claim benefit for has to do with the construction of BaileyBoucher, the AIDS hospice and facility. The planning for that was going ahead, and one of the developers in the valley there nearby decided that he did not want to have an AIDS facility and those kinds of people near the developments that he was planning. And he filed administrative objections with the city. And so it was like a mini law case in front of a hearing examiner. He made it quite clear that he was going to go all the way. He would take it to court if necessary. It turned out, we found out that he was president, Cal Knutson was his name, that he was president of the board of directors of the Seattle Art Museum. And I suggested at one meeting that why don't we have a demonstration at the next big opening of the Seattle Art Museum in order to try and embarrass him sufficiently. It turned out that one of those things was coming up in the not too distant future, and we were planning to hold a big demonstration. That's when the museum was only in Volunteer Park. The story is that a few days before that, his wife said to him, "Cal, how will we ever be able to face our friends?" And as a result of that conversation, he withdrew his opposition to the construction of BaileyBoucher. As I said, I was also active in the ACLU, both at the ACLU of Washington State and on the National ACLU board. The ACLU all around the country was heavily involved in the AIDS struggle. Litigation, taking the cases of people with AIDS, PWAs who had been denied services or who had been discriminated against, legislation. We pushed through the AIDS omnibus bill through the Washington State Legislature, which was probably a model bill for the country. But at that time, the activities of the ACLU were complementary because we would be in the Congress, we would be lobbying in the Congress at the same time that this stuff was going on, taking over an office of FDA or something like that.